The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the dusty general store, and Nora Anderson pressed her gloved hand against the wooden frame to steady herself as she peered through the small window at what would become her new home in Lovelock, Nevada. The year was 1882, and the settlement looked even smaller than she had imagined, just a scattered collection of weathered buildings against an endless stretch of sage and sand, with the Humboldt River cutting a lazy path through the barren landscape. She had come all this way from Boston, responding to an advertisement for a mail-order bride placed by a man named Robert Vaughn, who had written in careful script that he needed a wife to help manage his ranch and provide companionship in the isolated Nevada territory. The driver opened the door and helped her down, his weathered face showing concern as he glanced around the empty street. Nora smoothed her traveling dress, a practical dark blue cotton that was already covered in a fine layer of dust from the journey, and looked around for any sign of the man she was supposed to marry. According to his letters, Robert Vaughn was a rancher who lived several miles outside of town, but he had promised to meet her stage when she arrived. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Nora could feel sweat beginning to trickle down her back beneath her corset and chemise. "You sure someone's meeting you, miss?" the driver asked, setting her two battered trunks on the wooden sidewalk. "This here's a rough place for a woman alone." "I'm certain he'll be here," Nora said with more confidence than she felt. She pulled out the most recent letter from Robert Vaughn, dated 3 weeks earlier, confirming the date of her arrival. The stage had been delayed by a day due to a broken wheel outside of Reno, but surely he would have waited or made arrangements for her. The driver tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch, obviously eager to continue on to his next stop. Nora watched the stagecoach disappear down the dusty main street, leaving her standing alone with her belongings in a town where she knew absolutely no one. She had expected to feel nervous, but instead she felt a strange sense of determination settling over her. After the death of her parents from influenza the previous winter, she had nothing left in Boston except debts and painful memories. This was supposed to be her fresh start, even if that start now seemed uncertain. She walked into the general store, the bell above the door jangling as she entered. The interior was dim and cooler than the street outside and smelled of coffee, leather, and tobacco. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up from behind the counter where he was measuring out flour into paper sacks. "Help you, madam?" he asked, his eyes taking in her Eastern clothing and obvious unfamiliarity with the town. "I'm looking for Robert Vaughn," Nora said, approaching the counter. "I'm his intended bride, and I was supposed to meet him here today." The storekeeper's face fell, and Nora felt her stomach drop even before he spoke. "Madam, I'm real sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Robert Vaughn passed on about 2 weeks back. Snakebite got infected and he didn't make it into town for help in time." The words hit Nora like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the counter to keep herself steady. "Dead. But he wrote to me. He said he'd be here." "I know, madam. It's a terrible thing. Robert was a good man, kept to himself mostly out at his place, didn't have no family that anyone knows of. His ranch is still out there, I suppose, but there's nobody on it now." Nora's mind raced through her options. She had exactly $7.35 to her name, having spent nearly all her savings on the journey west. She had no family, no friends, and now no husband or home waiting for her. The storekeeper was watching her with sympathy, and she straightened her spine, refusing to break down in front of a stranger. "Is there a hotel in town?" she asked quietly. "Mrs. Patterson runs a boarding house 2 streets over. She might have a room available, but I'll be honest with you, madam, this town doesn't have much in the way of respectable work for women. Most ladies who come here either have family or a husband to provide for them. Nora thanked him and walked back outside into the harsh sunlight. She had survived the death of both parents, had nursed her mother through her final agonizing days while dealing with her own grief over her father's passing. She would survive this too. She just needed to think clearly and make a plan. She was standing there on the sidewalk, trying to figure out how to carry both her trunks to the boarding house, when she heard the sound of horse hooves on the packed dirt street. A man on a large bay horse rode up and dismounted in one fluid motion, tying the reins to the hitching post outside the general store. He was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling against the collar of his worn work shirt, and his eyes were a startling gray-green color that seemed to take in everything at once. He looked to be in his late 20s, perhaps 30 at most, and there was something careful and guarded about the way he moved, as if he was always expecting trouble. "Afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat as he passed her to enter the store. Nora nodded in response, turning her attention back to her trunks. She managed to drag one a few feet before having to stop and catch her breath. The heat was oppressive, and her corset was making it difficult to breathe properly. She heard the bell jangle again and glanced up to see the tall cowboy emerging from the store with a sack of supplies. He looked at her, then at the trunks, then back at her face. "You need help with those?" he asked. "I can manage, thank you," Nora said automatically, though it was clear she could not. The man set down his supplies and walked over to her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes from squinting in the sun, and a thin scar that ran along his jawline. "I don't mean to be forward, madam, but you look like you've had some bad news, and those trunks aren't going anywhere on their own. Where are you headed?" Something about his straightforward manner and the genuine concern in his voice made Nora's careful composure crack slightly. "The boarding house. I've just arrived in town to discover that my intended husband has died, and I find myself rather stranded." The man's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, a flash of understanding and sympathy that seemed born of personal experience with loss. "You're Robert Vaughn's bride from back east. I heard he'd sent for someone. I'm real sorry for your loss and for the situation you found yourself in. My name's Ryder Vaughn. Robert was my older brother." Nora stared at him, processing this information. He never mentioned having a brother. "We didn't talk much," Ryder said, and there was a note of old pain in his voice. "We had a falling out years back over our father's ranch when he died, split the property and went our separate ways. I run cattle on the north section and Robert had the south. I only heard about the snake bite after he was already gone. By then it was too late to send word to anyone." He paused, looking at her trunks again. "Let me help you get these to Mrs. Patterson's place. It's the least I can do, given the circumstances." Before Nora could protest, he had lifted one trunk easily and was waiting for her to lead the way. She picked up her smaller bag and started walking, very aware of his presence behind her as they made their way down the dusty street. The town was quiet in the afternoon heat, with most people taking shelter from the sun. A few curious faces appeared in windows as they passed, no doubt wondering about the Eastern woman and why Ryder Vaughn was carrying her belongings. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a two-story structure with a sagging porch and faded white paint. The proprietress herself answered the door, a stout woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she did not suffer fools gladly. "Need a room," Ryder said before Nora could speak. "This lady's had a difficult journey and she'll be needing a place to stay for a while." Mrs. Patterson's gaze moved from Ryder to Nora and back again. That'll be $4 a week, meals included. Payment in advance. Nora's heart sank. At that rate, her money would last less than 2 weeks. But she had no choice. She opened her small purse and counted out $4, leaving her with just over $3 to her name. Mrs. Patterson took the money and showed them to a small room on the second floor. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the street. Ryder set down the trunk and went back for the second one while Mrs. Patterson explained the house rules. No men in the rooms, no cooking in the rooms, breakfast at 7, supper at 6, and the front door locked at 9 o'clock sharp. When Ryder returned with the second trunk, Mrs. Patterson had already bustled off to attend to some other matter. He set the trunk down carefully and turned to Nora, seeming to struggle with what to say. "I know this isn't what you expected when you came out here," he said finally, "and I know we're strangers. But my brother sent for you in good faith, and it doesn't sit right with me to just leave you in a bad situation. If you need anything while you're figuring out what to do next, you can ask for me at the Lucky Star Saloon. I come into town most Saturdays for supplies." "That's very kind of you," Nora said, and meant it. "Though I'm not sure what I'll be able to do, I need to find work, but it seems options are limited here." Ryder looked uncomfortable. "I won't lie to you. This is a rough town and there's not much respectable work available. The saloon's always looking for girls, but that's not something I'd recommend. There's the schoolteacher position, but Mrs. Henderson has had that job for 10 years and isn't planning to give it up. Sometimes the hotel needs help with laundry or cleaning, but it doesn't pay much." "I can sew," Nora offered. "I worked as a seamstress back in Boston before my parents fell ill." Something shifted in Ryder's expression. "That might work. A lot of the ranchers' wives have to make do with catalog orders or try to sew things themselves. If you're good at it, you might be able to build up some business. You'd need somewhere to work and supplies, though." "I have my sewing kit with me and some fabric I brought for making my own dresses," Nora said, feeling the first small spark of hope. "If I could just find a few customers, I might be able to establish myself." Ryder nodded slowly. "Let me think on it. I might know some people who could use your services." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Robert's ranch, the house and land, it's all just sitting there empty now. I suppose legally it might even belong to you, since you came all this way to marry him. The contract you signed when you agreed to come out here might give you some claim, though I'm no lawyer." Nora hadn't considered that possibility. "Would you really not contest it?" "I've got my own place, and Robert and I may have had our differences, but he wanted to build something with a wife. Seems only fair that you should have the chance to make something of it if you want it." He cleared his throat. "Anyway, I should be going. Like I said, if you need anything, you can ask around for me." After he left, Nora sat down on the narrow bed and allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of her situation. She was in a strange town, in a territory that was still wild and largely unsettled, with almost no money and no clear path forward. And yet, she had met one person who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare, even if he was a stranger. It was more than she'd had when she woke up that morning. She spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking her trunks and organizing her few possessions. Among her things was the small wooden box that held her sewing supplies: needles, thread in various colors, scissors, pins, and measuring tape. She also had several yards of fabric she had purchased on sale before leaving Boston, thinking she would use it to make curtains and linens for her new home. Now, it might be the foundation of a business that could keep her from destitution. That evening at supper, she met the other boarders. A salesman passing through on his way to California, an elderly widow who had lived at the boarding house for years, and a young couple who were saving money to buy their own homestead. They were all curious about her, and she found herself telling an abbreviated version of her story. The other boarders were sympathetic, but also practical in their assessment of her situation. "You'll want to talk to some of the ranchers' wives," the young woman, whose name was Sarah, advised. "A lot of them are desperate for anything that reminds them of civilization. If you can do fine work, alterations, maybe make dresses that actually fit properly instead of having to order from a catalog and hope for the best, they'll pay for it." The next morning, Nora woke early and dressed in her best remaining dress, a gray cotton with modest trim. She pinned her dark hair into a neat bun and set out to explore the town properly. Lovelock was small, with just 2 streets of businesses and scattered homes beyond. There was the general store, the Lucky Star Saloon, a blacksmith, a small hotel, a lawyer's office, a doctor's office, and a few other establishments. Beyond the town proper, ranches spread out in all directions, taking advantage of the water from the Humboldt River to irrigate hay fields and provide for cattle. She stopped at the general store and asked the proprietor, who introduced himself as Mr. Henry Collins, if he knew of anyone who might need sewing done. He thought for a moment, then suggested she talk to the doctor's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who was known to be particular about her clothing and frequently complained about the lack of skilled seamstresses in the area. The doctor's house was a neat structure on the edge of town, painted yellow with white trim. Nora knocked on the door and waited, her heart beating fast. A woman in her 40s answered, her dark hair streaked with gray and her eyes intelligent and assessing. "Mrs. Hartwell, my name is Nora Anderson. I've just arrived in Lovelock and I'm a trained seamstress. I understand you might be interested in having some work done." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes lit up. "A seamstress, thank heavens. Come in, come in." She ushered Nora into a comfortable parlor filled with books and framed photographs. "I've been trying to alter a dress I ordered from San Francisco, but it's a disaster. The proportions are all wrong, and I don't have the skill to fix it properly. Can you do alterations as well as new construction?" "Yes, madam. I can do both." What followed was an hour of discussion about Mrs. Hartwell's wardrobe needs, during which Nora took measurements and examined the problematic dress from San Francisco. It was indeed poorly proportioned, but nothing that Nora couldn't fix with some careful adjustment of the seams and darts. They agreed on a price of $2 for the alteration, and discussed the possibility of Nora making 2 new dresses from fabric Mrs. Hartwell already owned. "I'll tell the other women in town about you," Mrs. Hartwell promised. "There are several ranchers' wives who would be thrilled to have access to a proper seamstress. Most of us have had to make do with our own limited skills, or pay exorbitant prices to have things sent from San Francisco or Sacramento." Nora left the Hartwell house feeling more hopeful than she had since arriving in Lovelock. She had her first customer and the promise of referrals. It wasn't a solution to all her problems, but it was a start. Over the next few days, Nora worked on Mrs. Hartwell's dress in her small room at the boarding house, carefully unpicking seams and reconstructing the bodice to fit properly. Word spread quickly in the small town, and by the end of the week, she had 3 more customers. The wife of a local rancher who needed everyday dresses that could withstand hard wear, the banker's wife who wanted a dress suitable for church, and a young woman about to be married who desperately needed a wedding dress. On Saturday, Nora was sitting in the small parlor of the boarding house, discussing fabric options with the young bride-to-be when there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Patterson answered it and called out, "Miss Anderson, you have a visitor." Nora excused herself and found Ryder Vaughn waiting in the entrance hall, his hat in his hands. He looked like he had cleaned up before coming to town, wearing a shirt that was obviously his best, though it was worn thin in places and carefully mended. "Mr. Vaughn," Nora said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you." "I wanted to check on how you were getting along," he said, a hint of color rising in his tanned cheeks. "And I asked around to some of the ranchers' wives like I said I would. Seems you've already found some customers on your own. Mrs. Hartwell has been very kind in recommending me," Nora said. "I'm managing to build up a small business. It's not much, but it's something." Ryder nodded, looking pleased. "That's real good. I also wanted to talk to you about Robert's place. I rode out there yesterday, and the house is in decent shape, though it needs some cleaning and airing out. The land's good, with water rights to a section of the river. If you wanted to take it on, you could live there instead of paying for the boarding house. You could set up a proper sewing room, maybe even take in work from some of the more distant ranches if you had your own place." Nora's heart leaped at the possibility, but then reality intruded. "I wouldn't know the first thing about managing a ranch, Mr. Vaughn. And living alone out there, away from town, as a single woman, it seems rather improper. You could hire some help, maybe a hand or two to manage the livestock. And as for the propriety of it, well, out here people are more concerned with surviving than with Eastern notions of what's proper." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I've been thinking about it, and I have a proposal. My ranch borders Robert's property. I could help you get the place running again, teach you what you need to know about managing the land and the few head of cattle Robert had left. In return, maybe you could do some mending and such for me. My clothes are falling apart and I'm not much good with a needle." It was a practical arrangement, but Nora hesitated. She barely knew this man, and yet here he was offering to help her establish herself in a way that would give her real independence. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You don't know me." Ryder was quiet for a moment, his gray-green eyes serious. "Because Robert sent for you in good faith, and you came all this way believing you'd have a home and a husband. It's not right that you should be left with nothing through no fault of your own. And because I know what it's like to be alone in a hard place with nobody to turn to." There was something in his voice when he said this last part that made Nora look at him more closely. She saw the loneliness that he usually kept carefully hidden, the same kind of loneliness she had been feeling since her parents died. Here was a man who spent his days working alone on his ranch, who had been estranged from his only brother, who came to town once a week and then returned to an empty house. Perhaps they could help each other. "All right," she said. "I'd like to see the property at least. And if it seems workable, then yes, I'll accept your help." Ryder's face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, and it transformed his whole appearance. He looked younger, less guarded, and Nora felt something shift in her chest, a small flutter of awareness that she quickly pushed aside. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. They made plans for him to take her out to the property the next day, Sunday, when she didn't have any immediate sewing deadlines. That night, Nora lay in her narrow bed and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been on a stagecoach heading toward what she thought would be her wedding. Now she was contemplating taking on a ranch of her own, with the help of a lonely cowboy who had no reason to be kind to her, except that he was, apparently, a fundamentally decent man. The next morning dawned clear and hot, as most days seemed to in this part of Nevada. Ryder arrived at the boarding house promptly at 8 o'clock with a wagon rather than his horse, explaining that it would be easier for transporting Nora and any belongings she might want to bring if she decided to move out to the ranch. The ride took about 45 minutes, following the river road out of town, and then turning onto a rough track that led through stands of cottonwood trees and open range dotted with sage. Nora tried to pay attention to landmarks so she could find her way, noting a distinctive rock formation and a curve in the river where willows grew thick along the banks. Robert Vaughn's ranch appeared as they crested a low rise. The house was a simple wooden structure, larger than a cabin but not quite grand enough to be called a proper ranch house. It had a covered porch across the front, windows that still had intact glass panes, and a stone chimney. Behind it were a barn, a corral, and several outbuildings in various states of repair. The whole property had an air of abandonment, with weeds growing tall in what had probably once been a kitchen garden, and the fence around the corral sagging in places. Ryder helped Nora down from the wagon and pulled a key from his pocket. "I got this from the lawyer in town. He's holding Robert's papers, such as they were. Like I said, you might have a legal claim to this place, given the circumstances." The interior of the house was dim and stuffy, smelling of dust and disuse. But as Ryder opened windows and shutters, letting in light and air, Nora could see that it was actually a pleasant space. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a good iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and even a small room that might have been intended as an office or parlor. The furniture was simple but well made. A table and chairs, a rocking chair by the fireplace, bed frames in both bedrooms, a chest of drawers. "Robert built most of this himself," Ryder said, running his hand along the smooth surface of the table. "He was good with his hands, better than me. I'm adequate at fixing things, but he actually enjoyed working with wood." Nora walked through the rooms, her mind already rearranging and imagining. The small room could be her sewing room with good light from the window. The main room was spacious enough to receive customers if they came to the house. The kitchen was far better equipped than anything she had access to at the boarding house. "What about water?" she asked practically. "There's a well out back and it's good water. The river's close enough to irrigate a garden if you wanted to put one in." Robert had about 30 head of cattle scattered on the property, but I think some have wandered off or been taken by rustlers since he died. "I could help you round up what's left, and you could decide whether you want to keep them or sell them." They spent the next hour walking around the property. Ryder pointed out the boundaries, showed her where the best grazing land was, and explained how the water rights worked in this area. It was all new to Nora, but she tried to absorb as much information as she could. The more he talked, the more she realized how much work it would take to run this place, even on a small scale. "I won't pretend this would be easy," she said as they stood looking out over the land from a small rise behind the house. "I don't know anything about ranching or farming, but I think I could make it work as a base for my sewing business at least, and maybe in time I could learn the rest." "You'd need help," Ryder said. "At least 1 ranch hand, maybe 2, especially during certain times of year. And you'd need to learn how to handle a gun living out here alone." Nora had never touched a gun in her life, and the thought made her nervous. But she was practical enough to recognize that Ryder was right. This was still frontier territory, and a woman alone needed to be able to protect herself. "Would you teach me?" she asked. Ryder looked at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You really want to do this? Take on this place?" "I think I do," Nora said slowly. "I need a home, Mr. Vaughn, and this could be one if I'm willing to work for it. I've learned over the past year that I'm stronger than I thought I was. I nursed both my parents through their final illnesses, settled their debts, and made my way across the country to a place I'd never seen to marry a man I'd never met. I think I can handle running a small ranch with some help." Something like admiration flashed across Ryder's face. "Then yes, I'll teach you what I can, And please call me Ryder. If we're going to be neighbors and working together, we might as well dispense with the formalities." "Nora," she said, offering her hand. His hand was calloused and strong, dwarfing her smaller one, but his grip was careful and respectful. The touch sent a strange warmth up her arm, and Nora pulled her hand back quickly, unsettled by her own reaction. They made plans as they drove back to town. Nora would finish her current sewing projects and give Mrs. Patterson notice that she would be leaving the boarding house at the end of the following week. Ryder would help her move her belongings out to the ranch and would spend some time getting the property back into working order. He would also ask around for a reliable ranch hand who might be willing to work for a woman. Over the next week and a half, Nora threw herself into her work with renewed energy. She finished Mrs. Hartwell's altered dress, completed 2 everyday dresses for the rancher's wife, and made good progress on the banker's wife's church dress. She also began work on the wedding dress, which was the most elaborate project she had taken on since arriving in Lovelock. The young bride, whose name was Margaret, wanted something special, with lace trim and careful pleating, and Nora was determined to give her a dress she would treasure. In between sewing projects, she packed her belongings and made lists of supplies she would need for the ranch. She visited the general store and priced basic provisions, carefully calculating what she could afford with her limited funds. Mr. Collins, the storekeeper, was willing to extend her a small amount of credit based on her expected sewing income, which would help her get established. True to his word, Ryder appeared every few days with some excuse to check on her progress or offer assistance. He brought her a simple revolver and a box of ammunition, explaining that he wanted her to have it at the ranch, even though her lessons would have to wait until after she moved. He also brought vegetables from his own garden, explaining that they would just go to waste otherwise. Nora suspected he was making excuses to be kind, but she accepted the offerings graciously. She found herself looking forward to his visits more than she wanted to admit. There was something comforting about his steady presence, the quiet way he listened when she talked about her sewing projects or her plans for the ranch. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, it was with careful thought and often with a dry humor that surprised her. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the boarding house in the relative cool of twilight, Nora asked him about his estrangement from Robert. They had been talking about minor matters, but something in the softening light seemed to invite more honest conversation. Ryder was quiet for a long time, staring out at the street. "Our father died suddenly 5 years ago. Heart gave out while he was working. Robert and I were both in our 20s, and we'd both been working the ranch with him our whole lives. He left the property to both of us equally, but Robert wanted to run everything his way, and I had different ideas. We fought about it, said things we shouldn't have said. Finally decided the only way to keep from killing each other was to split the property down the middle. We drew up papers, filed them with the county, and went our separate ways." "Did you ever try to reconcile?" Nora asked gently. "A few times. But we were both stubborn and there was too much pride in the way. I kept thinking there'd be time to work it out properly, and then he went and got himself killed by a damned snake." The pain in Ryder's voice was raw, even after the passage of weeks. "I never got to tell him I was sorry for my part in the fight, never got to say a lot of things." Nora reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. "He knew," she said softly. "Brothers always know, even when they're fighting. And he was reaching out in his own way by sending for me, trying to build a life. Maybe he was planning to make peace with you once he was settled." Ryder turned his hand over so their palms touched. "Maybe. I'd like to think so." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Nora saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. but then he pulled his hand back and stood up, putting distance between them. "I should go. Early start tomorrow. I'll be back at the end of the week to help you move." Nora watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, his tall figure soon swallowed by shadows. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beating faster than it should. She barely knew this man, had been engaged to his brother just weeks ago, even if she had never actually met Robert. It was too soon, too complicated, too improper to be feeling anything for Ryder Vaughn. And yet she could not deny the growing warmth she felt every time he appeared, the way her mood lifted at the sound of his voice. She forced herself to focus on practical matters. She had a wedding dress to finish, a ranch to move to, and a business to establish. There was no time for romantic complications, especially not with a man who was clearly still dealing with his own grief and regret. The wedding dress came together beautifully. Nora worked on it late into the nights, her fingers flying over the delicate fabric as she created something truly special. When Margaret came for her final fitting, she burst into tears at her reflection in the mirror, and her mother hugged Nora and promised to recommend her to everyone she knew. Finally, moving day arrived. Ryder came early with his wagon, accompanied by a young man he introduced as Tom Miller. Tom was maybe 20 years old, with sandy hair and an open, friendly face. He had been working on another ranch, but was interested in a position that might offer him more responsibility and a chance to eventually save enough to start his own place. "Miss Anderson," Tom said, removing his hat, "Ryder's told me about your situation. I'd be willing to work for room, board, and $20 a month if you've got need of a hand. I can handle cattle, do basic repairs, and I'm honest." "I can vouch for him," Ryder added. "His father worked for my father for years. Tom's reliable." Nora agreed, grateful to have the matter of hiring help resolved so easily. With 3 of them working, they loaded the wagon quickly. Her 2 trunks, her sewing supplies, the few personal items she had acquired, and the provisions she had purchased from the general store all fit with room to spare. The ride out to the ranch felt different this time, filled with anticipation rather than uncertainty. Tom rode ahead on his horse, and Nora sat beside Ryder on the wagon seat, very aware of how close they were, their shoulders occasionally brushing when the wagon hit a rough spot. "Nervous?" Ryder asked. "A little," Nora admitted. "It's a big change. You'll do fine. You've got good instincts and you're not afraid of hard work. That's more than a lot of people can say." When they arrived at the ranch, Nora was pleased to see that Ryder had been out ahead of them. The house had been thoroughly cleaned, the windows sparkled, and there were fresh curtains hanging in the kitchen that she recognized as coming from his own house. The weeds in the garden had been cleared, and the corral fence had been repaired. "You didn't have to do all this," Nora said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Wanted you to feel at home from the start," Ryder said simply. They spent the day unpacking and settling in. Tom would sleep in a small room in the barn that had been set up as ranch hand quarters, with a cot, a stove, and basic furniture. Nora took the larger of the 2 bedrooms in the house, and she set up her sewing room in the smaller room, arranging her supplies on shelves and setting up her work table near the window for the best light. By evening, the place was starting to feel like a home. Nora cooked her first meal in her new kitchen, a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and salt pork, and they all ate together at the big table. Tom was full of questions about her sewing work, confessing that his own mother had died when he was young and he had never learned how to mend properly. Nora promised to teach him some basic stitches so he could at least keep his clothes together. After supper, Ryder suggested they start the shooting lessons. They went out behind the barn where he had set up some bottles on fence posts as targets. The weight of the revolver felt strange in Nora's hand, and the first few shots went wild, the recoil stronger than she had expected. "Don't fight it," Ryder said, standing behind her and adjusting her grip. "Let the gun be an extension of your arm. Breathe out slowly and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." His hands were warm over hers, his body close enough that she could feel his heat even in the cooling evening air. Nora tried to focus on his instructions rather than on the distraction of his nearness. She took a breath, aimed carefully, and squeezed. This time the bottle shattered and she let out a small cry of triumph. "There you go," Ryder said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Keep practicing. You need to be able to hit a target without having to think about it too much." They practiced until it was too dark to see the targets clearly. Nora's hands were sore and her ears were ringing despite Ryder's warnings to expect the noise, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. She had hit the target 6 times out of her last 10 shots. Tom had already retired to his quarters in the barn, and Ryder stood by his horse preparing to ride back to his own place. The moon was rising, nearly full, casting silver light over the landscape. "Thank you for everything," Nora said. "For helping me move, for getting the house ready for the shooting lesson. I don't know how I would have managed any of this without you." "You'd have found a way," Ryder said. "You're resourceful." He mounted his horse, then looked down at her. "I'll be by in a couple of days to help Tom round up Robert's cattle and see how many we can find. In the meantime, you need anything, Tom can ride over to my place. It's only about 3 miles east, follow the river road." "I'll be fine," Nora said. "Good night, Ryder." She watched him ride away, then went inside to her new home. It felt strange to be in a house alone, responsible for everything. Back in Boston, she had lived with her parents until their deaths, and then briefly with a friend before making the journey west. Even at the boarding house, there had been other people around constantly. Now it was just her in this house, with Tom out in the barn and the vast Nevada landscape stretching in all directions. But instead of feeling frightened, Nora felt a sense of possibility. This was hers, or could be hers if she could make a go of it. She could build a life here, create something lasting and good, and if she was fortunate, she might not be as alone as she had feared. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Nora worked on her sewing projects during the day, and customers began coming out from town to pick up finished work or to commission new pieces. Word spread that she was skilled and reliable, and soon she had more work than she could handle alone. She began to think about taking on an assistant or apprentice. Tom proved to be an excellent ranch hand. He was up before dawn, tending to the cattle they had managed to round up, repairing fences and maintaining the buildings. He was also cheerful company, often singing as he worked, and he seemed genuinely happy to be on the ranch. Ryder came by frequently, always with some practical reason. He helped Tom with the heavier ranch work, taught Nora more about managing the property, and continued her shooting lessons. She improved steadily, and after a few weeks, she could hit a target reliably even at a distance. But beyond the practical help, Ryder's presence had become something Nora looked forward to with an intensity that both thrilled and worried her. She found herself listening for the sound of his horse, making excuses to walk outside when she knew he might be working with Tom in the barn. They talked for hours sometimes, sitting on the porch in the evening, discussing everything from politics to literature to their dreams for the future. She learned that Ryder had wanted to be a surveyor when he was young, fascinated by maps and the idea of charting new territory. But his father had needed him on the ranch, and he had put aside those dreams to fulfill his family obligations. She told him about her life in Boston, about her parents' loving marriage and the way their deaths had shattered her sense of security in the world. I felt so lost after they died, she confessed one evening. Like everything solid had turned to sand. Coming out here, answering Robert's advertisement, it was partly desperation and partly a desire to find something stable again. I thought if I could just have a home and a purpose, I would be all right. And now, Ryder asked. Do you have that? I think I might, Nora said slowly. I have this place and my work, and I'm starting to feel like I belong here. It's not what I expected, but it's good. Better than I hoped in some ways. I'm glad, Ryder said softly. They were sitting close together on the porch steps, and he reached over to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear that had come loose from her bun. The gesture was tender and intimate, and Nora felt her breath catch. Ryder, she began, not sure what she wanted to say. But before she could continue, Tom came around the corner of the house leading a horse. Sorry to interrupt, but this mare's got a stone in her shoe, and I wanted to get it out before it causes bruising. The moment broken, Ryder stood up and went to help Tom with the horse. But Nora sat there, her heart racing, knowing that something was building between them that would have to be addressed eventually. They could not go on indefinitely in this state of growing tension and unspoken feelings. As summer turned toward fall, the Nevada landscape shifting from green to gold and then to brown, Nora's sewing business flourished. She had completed the wedding dress to great acclaim, and Margaret's mother had indeed spread word of Nora's skills. She now had a steady stream of customers, including several women from the bigger ranches who were willing to pay well for quality work. She had also made friends with some of the ranchers' wives, particularly Martha Conway, whose husband ran a large cattle operation about 10 miles north. Martha was in her 30s, with 4 young children and a practical, no-nonsense approach to frontier life. She had come by one day to commission some dresses, and had ended up staying for tea and conversation. Since then, she visited regularly, often bringing her children, and the female companionship was a gift Nora had not realized she missed so much. You and Robert Vaughn seem awfully friendly, Martha observed one afternoon as they sat in Nora's kitchen, shelling peas while the children played outside under Tom's watchful eye. Nora felt her cheeks heat. He's been very helpful in getting me established here. Martha said, a knowing smile on her face. John says Ryder's been a different man these past couple of months. Less withdrawn, more likely to stop and talk when they run into each other on the range. Says he's got a light in his eyes that wasn't there before. We're friends, Nora said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Honey, there's nothing wrong with it if you're more than friends, Martha said gently. I know you came out here expecting to marry his brother, and I know that's complicated. But Robert's gone and Ryder's here, and from what I can see, you're good for each other. It hasn't been very long, Nora protested. People would talk. People always talk. This is the frontier, not a Boston drawing room. Out here, we care more about whether people are honest and hardworking than about whether they've observed the proper mourning period for someone they never actually met. Martha paused, her expression serious. Life's hard out here, Nora. When you find someone who makes it easier, someone you can trust and who cares about you, you hold onto that. Don't let propriety or what people might think rob you of a chance at happiness. That night, after Martha had left and Tom had retired to the barn, Nora sat on her porch and thought about what her friend had said. She had been so focused on being practical, on establishing her business and learning to run the ranch, that she had tried to ignore her growing feelings for Ryder. But they were becoming impossible to ignore. She thought about him constantly, felt a rush of joy whenever he appeared, found excuses to touch his hand or stand close to him. And unless she was very much mistaken, he felt the same way about her. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Ryder emerged from the darkness, riding up to the house and dismounting. He tied his horse to the porch railing and climbed the steps, looking uncertain. "I know it's late," he said, "but I was riding back from checking on some cattle in the north pasture, and I saw your light was still on. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Everything's fine," Nora said. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." They sat together on the porch, sipping coffee and talking quietly. The conversation wandered from topic to topic, but underneath it all, Nora could feel the current of something unspoken, pulling them closer together. Finally, Ryder set down his cup and turned to face her. "Nora, I need to say something, and I hope I don't offend you or make things awkward between us." "All right," Nora said, her heart beating faster. "I know you came out here to marry my brother, and I know it hasn't been that long since you arrived or since he died. But these past couple of months, getting to know you, helping you get established here, it's been the best time I've had in years. Maybe the best time I've ever had. I look for excuses to come by, just so I can see you and talk to you. When I'm at my place, I'm thinking about you. When I wake up in the morning, the first thing I wonder is whether I can justify riding over here." He took a breath. "What I'm trying to say badly is that I care about you, a great deal, and I think you might care about me too. But if I'm wrong, or if this is too soon, or if the fact that you were supposed to marry Robert makes this impossible, then tell me now, and I'll step back." Nora looked at this man who had been nothing but kind and patient with her, who had helped her without asking for anything in return, who had taught her to shoot and to manage her property, and had given her the tools to build an independent life. She thought about how safe she felt in his presence, how her whole day seemed brighter when he was around. And she thought about Martha's words, "When you find someone who makes life easier, someone you can trust and who cares about you, you hold onto that." "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "I do care about you. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was too soon and too complicated. But I can't seem to help it. You've become the most important person in my life, Ryder." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, warming and illuminating everything. He reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, and they sat there for a long moment, just holding hands and marveling at the fact that they had finally acknowledged what had been growing between them. "Can I court you properly?" Ryder asked. "I know the circumstances are unusual, but I want to do this right." "Yes," Nora said, feeling like her heart might burst from the mixture of joy and relief flooding through her. "I would like that very much." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender that Nora felt tears spring to her eyes. Then he stood, pulling her up with him. For a moment they stood close together, and Nora thought he might kiss her. But instead he cupped her face gently with his free hand and simply looked at her, as if memorizing every detail. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "It's late and I want to do this properly, but I'll be back tomorrow. We could have dinner together if you'd like. I'll even clean up properly and bring flowers." "I don't need flowers," Nora said, though she was charmed by the offer. "Just bring yourself." After he left, Nora went inside and sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, feeling like her whole world had shifted on its axis. She had come to Nevada expecting to marry one man and had instead found another. She had expected to be dependent, and instead had discovered her own strength. And now, she had a chance at something she had thought was lost when her parents died. A chance to build a family of her own with someone she genuinely loved. The courtship that followed was unconventional by Eastern standards, but perfectly suited to frontier life. Ryder came by nearly every day, and they worked together on various projects around the ranch while getting to know each other more deeply. He taught her how to ride better, taking her out onto the range to see the full extent of her property and his. She mended his clothes and made him new shirts, taking secret pleasure in measuring him and seeing him wear things she had made with her own hands. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. Ryder confessed that he had been lonely for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. Nora told him about the grief that had nearly swallowed her whole after her parents died, and how coming west had given her a reason to keep going. "I think we both needed this," Ryder said one afternoon as they sat by the river, watching the water flow past. "Needed each other. Sometimes I wonder if Robert knew somehow that bringing you out here would lead to this, like he was trying to fix things even from beyond death." "Maybe," Nora said. "Or maybe it's just chance and circumstance. But either way, I'm grateful." As October arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of winter, Ryder asked Nora to marry him. They were sitting on her porch, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill, when he took her hand and asked the question she had been hoping to hear. "I don't have a fancy ring yet," he said. "I'll get you one, I promise, but I didn't want to wait any longer to ask. Will you marry me, Nora? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" "Yes," Nora said, and then said it again, louder. "Yes, Ryder, I will." He kissed her then, finally, and it was everything she had been imagining and more. His lips were warm and gentle, and the kiss was full of promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They were married in November, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Lovelock. Mrs. Hartwell and Martha Conway helped Nora make a dress in pale blue silk, more subdued than a traditional white wedding gown but beautiful in its simplicity. Tom served as Ryder's best man, and Martha stood up with Nora. The church was full of people who had become friends over the past few months, ranchers and townspeople who had watched their courtship and approved of the match. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the town hall, with food and music and dancing. Nora danced with her new husband, feeling like she was floating. When she caught Martha's eye across the room, her friend gave her a knowing smile and a nod of approval. That night, Ryder brought Nora back to his ranch, which would now be their primary home. He had spent the past few weeks fixing it up, adding feminine touches he thought she might like. They decided to keep Robert's ranch as well, with Tom managing it and the sewing business remaining based there. It gave them twice the land and resources, and Tom was thrilled with the increased responsibility and the promise that he might eventually be able to buy the property from them when he had saved enough money. The first months of their marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. They learned each other's habits and preferences, learned how to work together and how to resolve disagreements. Ryder was patient and thoughtful, always considering Nora's opinions and treating her as an equal partner in all decisions. Nora brought warmth and life to his previously lonely house, filling it with laughter and conversation and the small comforts that made a house a home. Winter came, harsh and cold, and they spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Nora continued her sewing work, and Ryder managed both ranches with Tom's help. They attended church socials and had dinners with neighbors, gradually building a community around themselves. In the spring, Nora discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and a certain amount of trepidation, as they were both aware of the dangers that childbirth posed, especially in such an isolated area. But Dr. Hartwell assured them that Nora was healthy and strong, and his wife Alina promised to be present for the birth. As Nora's pregnancy progressed, Ryder became increasingly protective and attentive. He insisted she cut back on her sewing work, and hired a young woman from town to help with the household chores. He checked on her constantly, bringing her whatever she needed and worrying over every small discomfort. "I'm not fragile," Nora reminded him one afternoon in late summer, when he had insisted she sit down after finding her hanging laundry. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know," Ryder said, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hand. "But you're my whole world, Nora. I can't help worrying." "I'll be fine," she said, touched by his concern. "We'll both be fine." Their son was born in early September, on a beautiful clear morning when the heat of summer was just beginning to ease. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Nora thought she could not bear any more. But Alina Hartwell was there, calm and capable, and Ryder held her hand and whispered encouragement, and finally, their baby was born. When Nora heard her son's first cry, she burst into tears of relief and joy. Ryder was crying too, his tough cowboy exterior completely undone by the sight of his child. Alina placed the baby in Nora's arms and they looked down at him together, marveling at his tiny, perfect features. "He's beautiful," Ryder whispered. "You're amazing. I love you so much." They named him Daniel Robert Vaughn, after both of Nora's father and Ryder's brother. It felt right to honor the past while looking toward the future. Daniel was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs and a tendency to sleep through the night far earlier than Alina had predicted. As Nora recovered from the birth, and they adjusted to life with a baby, the house filled with new sounds and rhythms. Ryder proved to be a devoted father, taking shifts walking with Daniel when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, and spending long periods just watching his son sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I never thought I'd have this," he told Nora one night as they sat together watching Daniel nurse. "A family of my own, a wife I love, a son. After Robert died, I thought I'd spend the rest of my life alone, and then you arrived and everything changed." "For me too," Nora said. "I came here thinking I'd be fulfilling a contract, making the best of a practical arrangement. Instead, I found home. I found love. I found everything I didn't even know I was looking for." The years that followed were full and happy. Daniel grew into a sturdy toddler, and then a curious little boy who loved following his father around the ranch. 2 years after Daniel's birth, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Alina, after both her mother and the woman who had helped deliver both children and had become a dear friend. 3 years after that, another daughter arrived, Lucy Martha, named for Ryder's mother and for Nora's friend Martha Conway. The ranches prospered under their combined management. Tom eventually married a schoolteacher from Carson City, and they bought Robert's ranch from Nora and Ryder, staying on as neighbors and friends. Nora's sewing business evolved into a small dress shop that she ran from a building in town, employing 2 other seamstresses. Ryder expanded their cattle operation and became known throughout the region as a fair and honest rancher. They faced challenges, as all families do. There were harsh winters when they worried about the cattle and their children's health. There were dry years when the river ran low and the grazing land suffered. There were tensions with neighboring ranches over water rights and occasional threats from rustlers. But through it all, they faced everything together, their love and partnership growing stronger with each challenge overcome. As their children grew, Nora and Ryder made sure to tell them the story of how they met, how Nora had come west to marry Robert and had ended up with Ryder instead. Daniel, in particular, was fascinated by the story of the uncle he had never known but whose name he carried. "Do you think Uncle Robert would be happy that you married Mama instead?" he asked his father one evening when he was about 8 years old. Ryder thought about it carefully before answering. "I think he would be. Your Uncle Robert was a good man who wanted to build a family. He would be happy that your mother found a home here and that we're taking care of the land he loved. And I like to think he'd be proud of you, carrying his name forward." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ryder surprised Nora with the ring he had promised her on the night he proposed. It was a simple gold band with a small ruby, her birthstone, and it must have cost him dearly. But when she tried to protest the expense, he silenced her with a kiss. "You gave up everything to come out here," he said. "Your whole life back east, your certainty, your security. You took a chance on a future you couldn't see, and you've built something amazing. You've given me 3 beautiful children, a home full of love and laughter, and more happiness than I ever thought possible. A ring is the least I can do." Nora wore the ring proudly, alongside the simple gold band they had exchanged at their wedding. When people in town asked about it, she told them about her patient, loving husband who kept his promises, no matter how long it took. As the century drew toward its close, bringing with it all the changes and modernizations that came with progress, Nora and Ryder watched their children grow and their ranches thrive. Daniel showed an aptitude for ranching and announced his intention to take over the family business someday. Sarah wanted to be a teacher like Tom's wife, and Lucy was still young enough that her dreams changed weekly, from veterinarian to artist to explorer. On a warm evening in late summer, 20 years after Nora had first arrived in Lovelock, she and Ryder sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on. Their children were inside, arguing good-naturedly over something, and the sound of their voices was a constant background music that Nora never tired of hearing. "Do you ever regret it?" Ryder asked, reaching over to take her hand. "Coming out here, everything you gave up?" Nora thought about the question seriously. She thought about her parents, who she still missed but whose memory had softened into something sweet rather than painful. She thought about Boston, which now seemed like a different world, something from a story rather than a place she had actually lived. And she thought about the girl she had been when she stepped off that stagecoach, so uncertain and afraid but trying desperately to be brave. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "I came out here thinking I'd be alone in a practical arrangement with a stranger. Instead, I found you. I found home. I found everything that matters. You've made sure I was never alone, not from the moment we met." Ryder lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had that first night when they admitted their feelings for each other. "And I never will let you be alone. That's a promise I intend to keep for the rest of my life." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Nora leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and felt a deep contentment settle over her. She had traveled across a continent to an unknown future, had lost the man she thought she would marry before ever meeting him, and had instead found something infinitely better. She had found a true partner, a great love, and a life richer than anything she could have imagined on that dusty day when she first arrived in Nevada territory. The children came out onto the porch then, Daniel carrying Lucy on his shoulders while Sarah skipped ahead. They settled around their parents, Daniel sitting on the porch steps, Sarah in the rocking chair, and Lucy climbing into Nora's lap despite being too old for such things. "Tell us the story," Lucy demanded, as she often did, "about how you and Papa met." So Nora told the story once again, of the stagecoach and the general store and the lonely cowboy who had helped a stranded mail-order bride. She told about learning to shoot and to run a ranch, about the slow building of trust and friendship into love. Ryder added his own details, about how he had fallen in love with her determination and strength, about how she had brought light into his dark world. The children had heard the story dozens of times, but they never tired of it. And as Nora watched their faces in the gathering twilight, she saw not just her children but the future stretching out before them, full of possibility and promise. This was what she and Ryder had built together. Not just ranches and businesses and property, but a family rooted in love, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. That night, after the children had finally gone to bed and the house was quiet, Nora and Ryder stood together at their bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. The land rolled away in silver shadows, their cattle dark shapes scattered across the pastures, the river a ribbon of light in the distance. "I love you," Ryder said, pulling her close. "Every single day I love you more than the day before." "I love you too," Nora replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for finding me when I was lost. Thank you for giving me a home and a family and a life I love. Thank you for making sure I was never alone." He kissed her then, tender and sweet, a kiss that held 20 years of partnership and devotion. And as they finally settled into bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Nora thought about the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. She had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride, and had found so much more than she could have dreamed. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, and most importantly, she had found love with a lonely cowboy who had made sure she never felt alone again. The morning sun would bring new challenges and new joys, as it always did. There would be cattle to tend and children to raise and a business to run. There would be hard times and good times, sickness and health, struggle and triumph. But through it all, they would face everything together, just as they had for 20 years and would continue to do for all the years to come. And as Nora drifted off to sleep, secure in the warmth of her husband's embrace and the knowledge that her children slept safely under their roof, she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Nevada expecting duty and obligation had instead found a partnership built on mutual respect, affection, and deep, abiding love. She had arrived thinking she would be alone in a marriage of convenience, but the lonely cowboy had made sure she never was again, giving her not just his protection and help but his whole heart. And in return, she had given him hers, building a life together that was more than either of them could have created alone. The story of how they met would be told and retold through the generations of their family, becoming a cherished piece of family history. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren would grow up hearing about the mail-order bride and the lonely cowboy, about how love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, about how two lost souls had found each other in the vast Nevada wilderness and built something lasting and true. But that was all still to come. For now, in this moment, there was just Nora and Ryder, husband and wife, partners and best friends, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The future stretched out before them, unknown and unwritten, but they would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart, making sure that neither of them was ever alone again.